You're watching Act.tv. I'm Julianna Forlano. Next up is our recurring guest, Sasha Abramsky, who's been taking a close look at Trump and the GOP's coordinated attacks on American democratic norms and institutions. In his recent piece for The Nation, he writes about government-mandated child abuse and human rights violations masquerading as emergency public health measures. Sasha, thanks for joining us on the program today.
My pleasure. Good morning.
Gee, you always write about the light topics that are, easily passed by on the news.
Yeah, it's not terribly good for the spiritual health, but honestly, given what's happening at the moment in the world, it's where I feel my journalism needs to be.
Absolutely.
I mean, you talked about the sort of government-mandated child abuse, and, in any other era, I think I'd be very careful about using language like that because it is hyperbolic and it's provocative, and it's making a bold claim, which is that in our name, the government is doing things that rise to the level of abuse and or torture, certainly human rights violations of the Geneva Convention and so on. And in this era, it's almost impossible to get hyperbolic because no matter what the Trump administration, it doesn't do full justice to the magnitude of the horror that they're inflicting on certain demographics, especially undocumented immigrants. So when I was talking about child abuse, what I'm talking about is that there's a policy in place and has been for a better part of 2 months now to get about due process on the southern border. So anyone who comes over the border at the moment and claims asylum, legally they have a right to due process. Doesn't matter that we're in the middle of a pandemic. They have a right to a court hearing. They have a right to try and present their case to explain why they fear going back to their home country. And instead, the government is just literally taking them, dumping them back over the border. And this is 20,000 people. We're not talking about a couple dozen, 20,000 people, including at least 600 kids. And to sort of understand the magnitude of this, since March, the Washington Post reports that only 2 people, not 2,000, not 20,000, not any magnitude of 2, but since March, 2 people have been granted asylum on the southern border. This is extraordinary. This is the land that defines itself, or likes to think it defines itself, by its open arms, its welcoming approach to immigrants. Our national symbol is the Statue of Liberty and Emma Lazarus's poem. And we have fallen so far that we're using a pandemic as an excuse to dump children back into areas where Human Rights Group chronicles that they are raped, they are kidnapped, and they are murdered on a regular basis. It's completely extraordinary.
And we were just watching Tucker Carlson, propagandist on Fox News. I don't want to call him a newsman or journalist. He's just a propagandist, talking about how the illegal, quote unquote, illegal immigrants should not be protected, even if they're frontline workers here in the country. I mean, the rhetoric that is being used
is so extraordinary right now. It's a rhetoric of infestation. It's a rhetoric that immigrants bring disease. It's a rhetoric that immigrants bring job loss. And, and there's a vague distinction in some circles between undocumented immigrants and legal immigrants, but it's a pretty vague distinction. And Trump's policy, the de facto policy at the moment, is to ban all immigration. This is Stephen Miller's strategy. They did it temporarily for 60 days. CNN reported a couple of weeks ago they were going to extend it indefinitely. And then yesterday, reports began circulating that they are indeed about to extend the travel ban indefinitely. Our land borders are sealed. Our land borders are going to stay sealed.
It's exactly what he wanted.
Yeah, I mean, look, Miller's been trying for years to use mumps, measles, flu, and various other diseases as public health excuses to shut down immigration. And finally, they have a pandemic, and their response, instead of coordinating with the world, which any other administration would have coordinated with every other country on earth and groups like the World Health Organization to have a coordinated global response, Trump's response is, we're going to lock down the country, shut the borders, declare all immigrants to be the enemy, and then beat up on groups like the World Health Organization. And we see yesterday this extraordinary tweet where via Twitter, Trump sends a letter to the WHO in the middle of a pandemic, threatening to permanently defund it and to take America out. Now, anyone who studies history remembers Hitler's theatrical storming out of the League of Nations in 1933. The idea that, you know, Germany would go it alone, that any international organization was the enemy, that any attempt to coordinate global responses to big issues was somehow communist. And so Hitler stormed out of the League of Nations, and we all know how that ended. You know, it led to a road of ultranationalism, led to a world war. And now Trump is in the process of storming out of the World Health Organization. You know, who knows, maybe he'll storm out of the United Nations by the end of it, declaring all immigrants to be the enemy, locking down the country because the fatherland must be protected. You know, every way that you look at this, this is essentially the normalizing of a fascist rhetoric at the highest levels of government. And the fact that America, the land of liberty, you know, the land that we like to self-proclaim as the land of liberty and freedom, the land made great by immigration, the fact that America has fallen so low breaks my heart. And so, you know, I do use that language that, you know, in some ways is quite hyperbolic, but I think it really bespeaks to the enormous danger of this moment. And the fact that we have a man as unstable as Trump, as vindictive as Trump, in charge of the country during the greatest public health crisis since the 1918-19 Spanish flu epidemic.
I think it's very important that you use those hyperbolic terms, by the way, because they're only hyperbolic if they're not true, and therefore they're not exactly hyperbolic at this.
Yeah,
I
mean that's sort of the point here, that there's nothing you can say anymore. That I mean, you know, when the president goes on live TV and says, I'm self-medicating with a completely unproven drug that my own doctors have told me might be dangerous, and that, you know, pretty much every public health expert is saying don't use for this situation. You know, we're in a completely Alice in Wonderland world.
What is this about? Not to go left on the fascism talk here, but or whatever. But you know, there were Fox Media Matters reported 7 different times that Fox News promoted taking hydroxychloroquine to prevent COVID over the last week. And then Sinclair Media ran a national segment promoting hydroxychloroquine as a coronavirus treatment, even though they're saying that people who take it are more likely to die.
Yeah, I don't get it. I mean, I don't think it's
Is Trump doing? One of the people in our stream chat said, well, maybe, you know, said that they don't believe that Trump is even taking the drug, and that it's likely just another publicity stunt to get people's eyeballs away from the fact that, like you say, there is a human rights crisis being perpetrated by our administration.
Because Trump peddles so many lies, even if he's not lying, he has no reason to be given the benefit of the doubt, because he's a politician who's made a career through obfuscation and through, you know, shredding any notion of objective truth. So, you know, this miasma this Trump creates around everything he says, you know, at the end of the day, all it does is it sows chaos. So, you know, we don't know whether or not Trump's taking this drug. It doesn't really matter.
That's what I say.
He's going on national TV and he's saying it. And he's saying it, you know, maybe as a distraction, maybe because he genuinely believes it works, you know, maybe because, he, you know, I mean, some people have said there's a financial stake in it, and I've no idea if that's true or not. But the fact is that at this point, there's an administration that we have no reason to give the benefit of the doubt to on anything. So when they go on the air and they say, you know, Trump's been saying recently, well, the coronavirus death figures are inflated. This is his latest thing. You know, we say 90,000 people have died, but actually most of them were old and were about to die. I mean, that's basically what he's saying. It's completely disgraceful, because all of the medical expertise says this is how many people have died. And in actual fact, we're probably underreporting it, because we're not catching people who die at home. We're not catching people, you know, who died early in the epidemic and weren't, you know, they weren't autopsied. You know, there are a whole bunch of groups that are missed out in that calculation. And that's true all over the world, not just in the United States, that most public health experts think that global numbers are underrepresenting what's going on. But it's politically expedient for Trump to sort of say, all right, you know, this is all a big brouhaha about nothing. We need to open the economy again. And I understand why he needs to open the economy. He needs to open it because, you know, things are really bad for tens of millions of families. And, you know, for that reason alone, it's important to, you know, find ways to get people employed again, but also for Trump's political prospects, that if he wants to get reelected, it's going to be very hard, even with massive voter intimidation, which is Republican strategy now. But even with all of that, it's going to be really hard for Trump to get to 270 electoral college votes with 25% unemployment. So Trump absolutely, you know, absolutely needs to convince people it's safe enough not just to go back to work, but then to consume again. because it doesn't matter if you sort of force people back to work, if nobody's going out to restaurants, nobody's going out to, shopping malls, because at the end of the day, the economy still sputters along. So, Trump absolutely has to minimize the risk of this pandemic spreading. And so when you have somebody who is so clearly putting to one side science, sidelining experts, Fauci hasn't been on national TV this past week at all, neither has Dr. Birx. These are the people who actually know what they're about. But they're being sidelined by this political show, this sort of circus carnival act designed to say everything's okay. And so when Trump goes on air and he says, oh, I'm taking, this particular drug because it's a miracle cure, whether or not he's taking it, the signal he's sending is, oh, this is not a big deal. You just need to do what I'm saying. You just need to take these unproven drugs and everything will be okay. And the thing is, it's the height of irresponsibility. That's not what a national leader is supposed to do in a crisis. You're supposed to instill confidence in the public. You're supposed to calmly tell it like it is. You're supposed to be educative, not propagandistic. Trump's doing everything you're not supposed to do in a public health crisis because it serves him politically. And I think the history books are going to...
It makes me love Cuomo more and more.
Yeah, well, exactly.
I'm like, oh, well, all that stuff he did in the past, I don't care.
I mean, that's it. And, and to be fair, Republican governors like Mike DeWine in Ohio as well, there are certain figures on both political parties who have sort of shone in this moment. They've behaved responsibly. They've done what the public health experts need to do, and they haven't tried to make political hay out of what's going on.
Let's talk about the GOP's coordinated attempt with the White House to stymie voter participation and mail-in voting in this upcoming election, including trying to close down the post office.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. That, in the middle of a pandemic, if you want a country of 330 million people to be able to have a fair and open election, you've got to make it easy to vote. And two things are going to happen if you don't have mail-in voting. The first is you're going to have an awful lot of people, especially in poor neighborhoods where there aren't that many polling places, and they know if they're going to go, they're going to have to stand in line in close proximity to other people for hours and hours. You're going to have a whole bunch of poor people who don't vote. Second thing that's going to happen...
We need to give masks out at the voting booth.
It doesn't matter. Even if they give masks out, you're going to have a significant percentage of people who are just too scared to turn up to vote, or in the middle of a pandemic, they have so many other things to worry about. They don't have time to spend 4 or 5 or 6 hours in one of the few polling places that remains open. So we know that if you don't have mail-in voting, number one, fewer people turn up to the polls to vote. Second thing that happens is an awful lot of people who work as poll workers. And this is volunteer work, and it's mainly elderly people who work as poll workers. We know that a lot of those people are going to be too frightened to turn up, which means you're going to have a shortage of poll workers, which means you're going to have even longer lines for people who do turn up to vote. So you get a perfect storm. If you get rid of mail-in voting or you minimize mail-in voting, you make it really, really, really difficult to have a free and fair election. But the second thing is, if you get rid of mail-in voting, or if you say, well, being afraid of COVID-19 is not a legitimate reason to have mail-in voting, which is what Texas has now decided, it's going to have a disproportionate effect again on Democratic voters generally who live in poorer urban neighborhoods where there are fewer polling places, because richer suburban neighborhoods have far more places to vote. They always have had, and they still will in this pandemic.
Sasha, what do you make of Greg Palast's thoughts that even mail-in voting would still underrepresent poor people and people of color because of their propensity to have to move so much because of economic conditions and that kind of thing? Do you think it wouldn't be...
We know there are so many obstacles to poor people voting in this country, and the lower down the economic ladder you go, the less likely you are to vote. That's statistically true. It's been true for decades. There's nothing new about this moment. What is new about this moment is the fact that there is a stampede by the Republican Party. It's a central part of their election strategy now, not just one of many. It's the central part of their re-election strategy, that they're going to tamp down voting so aggressively that it becomes not just a hindrance if you're poor, but almost impossible if you're poor to vote fairly. So we're going to have this attack on the postal system. We're going to have legal actions by state attorneys generals in Republican states against cities expanding mail-in ballots. So you have in Texas the state attorney general arguing that we must push pause on Dallas and Houston and all the other big cities' efforts to expand mail-in voting. you're going to have, according to the New York Times yesterday, a $50 million or $20 million effort to have 50,000 Republican poll monitors going around, oftentimes trying to intimidate people away from the voting booths. And we know this happened because in the past few election cycles, there have been these sort of semi-paramilitary groups that go to the voting stations, some of them wearing armbands saying ballot security task force and looking very militaristic. And, you know, that has a scare factor. That scares a lot of people away from voting. And you know exactly where those monitors are going to be. They're not going to be in rich suburban neighborhoods in, you know, conservative parts of the country. Those poll monitors with their paramilitary outfits and all the intimidation spectacle that goes with it are going to be heading straight to poor neighborhoods in cities where there are more Democratic voters. It's a deliberate attempt to scare people away from voting. And, you know, the very idea that in the 21st century, in a country that prides itself on its democratic infrastructure, the very idea that the governing party now has as a central re-election strategy voter intimidation and voter suppression is just, I would say it's shocking, except nothing is shocking in the Trump era anymore.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. We're speaking with Sasha Abramsky, freelance journalist and a professor of journalism at UC Davis. Sasha, we're talking about Trump and the GOP's coordinated run toward fascism. You know, Naomi Wolf writes the 10 steps toward that fascist regimes take. And we're talking about all of those now, right? Invoking a terrifying internal and external enemy, the brown people from somewhere else, right? We've got that, although I would say the fascists who are right here on our shores are one of the terrifying internal enemies. Setting up an internal surveillance system. We just had the recent passage of the bill that's going to last week that's going to let them look at everything you ever look at on the internet without a warrant. Have you looked into that? That certainly seems to line up with the 10 steps toward fascism.
You know, I haven't looked into that specific piece of legislation, but I think when you look at what's happening here, you know, 4 years ago, Trump gave every indication of the kind of government he would put in place and every indication of the kind of policies he would put in place. There's no mystery here. Anyone who's been paying attention knows that this man is absolutely contemptuous of democratic norms and limits. And everyone who's been paying attention to what's been happening in the broader GOP knows that he's essentially turned it into a one-man show. This isn't the big tent party of, you know, whether it's or Reagan. This is the fanatical end result of decades of cronyism, decades of rhetoric that government is bad, decades of rhetoric that arming the people is good. So you have these militias now running rampant and bringing weapons to political protests. None of this is a mystery. The pandemic is just condensing it all and accelerating it all. So, you know, as the chaos intensifies, you know, you talked about these domestic fascist movements. As the chaos has intensified, you've seen these movements taking to the streets and intimidating political officials in Michigan and elsewhere with weaponry. And the thing is, when armed paramilitaries storm government buildings with their AK-15s or, you know, with their high-powered weaponry, that's no different than the brown shirts running rampant in Nazi Germany or pre-Nazi Germany. It's no different from the paramilitaries that ran rampant in Central and in Southern America in the 1970s and 1980s. You know, when you empower ideologues with weapons and you give them the support of the government, which Trump has been doing through his tweets, liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia, and so on, you legitimize paramilitarism. And as soon as you legitimize paramilitarism, you basically put a gun to the head of democracy. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing the administration and Trumpism putting a gun to the head of democracy. And it's absolutely savage. And, you know, this notion that, you know, somehow American exceptionalism will let us muddle through, that's not how it works. We muddle through, if we muddle through, because we, the people, find a way, even in a pandemic, to resist what Trumpism is doing. But we do not muddle through if we sit back, put our head in the sand, and hope things will be okay just because America somehow is different.
Well, that's why we try to report on what activists are doing at the top of the program here and give people something that they can do to stay active during this pandemic. You said in your piece that Jared Kushner, when he told Time Magazine that he refused to roll out postponing the November election, that the statement could have been a trial balloon, as you put it. Can you talk a little bit about what you think happened in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, look, there was nothing accidental about it. Kushner was asked a very straightforward question. Is the administration considering postponing the election?
How
Because
could they even do that? That's
well,
okay.
this is the
Sorry.
thing. So there's no constitutional mechanism to do it. You can't. There's no legitimate constitutional mechanism to postpone that election. It's one of those things set in stone. Kushner's response was, yes, that's the plan, or I believe that's the plan. There's nothing accidental about that. But, it's not as if he sort of was asked an ambiguous question and tripped over his words. He was asked a very straightforward question, and Kushner is a very senior advisor to the White House. He's as inept as you can get. He's as corrupt as you can get. He's as entitled as you can get, all of which in the Trump administration serve as, qualifications, qualified in the Trump administration to wreak havoc wherever they give him permission to wreak havoc, whether it's the Mideast peace plan that he has been supposedly working for the last few years, or coordinating the coronavirus response. This guy who has never been elected to anything is unfortunately extraordinarily powerful. And so when he goes on to a national media platform and he says, yeah, the plan is that we're going to suspend the election, you got to take it seriously. It doesn't mean that they have it set in stone. It doesn't mean it's, something they're definitely about to roll out. But you can bet your life that if they think they're going to lose this election, if the polls show they're 15 to 20% behind Joe Biden, that they've lost the elderly voters, all of which is happening at the moment.
The elderly voters are dead.
Yeah. The elderly voters are scared and they don't like the Trump response. And by large margins, they're now rejecting Trumpism. And since elderly voters vote, that's a huge problem for Trump. So if they go into the election and their internal polling shows that, they don't really have any chance of catching him, even with voter suppression, it seems to me, given everything they've done so far, that they will try and find some way to either postpone the election or to illegitimate it, to say, it's all voter fraud. We're not going to, cede power. And, this should be top of everyone's priority list. Biden should be talking about this every day. Nancy Pelosi should be talking about it every day. The big governors, Newsom, Cuomo, they should be talking about it every day. And they should be trying to work out ways to prevent, by any means necessary, the postponement of this election, because there's no constitutional rationale for it. In the middle of the pandemic in 1918-19, there were midterm elections. And people went to the polls and voted for the reason that voting is so sacred to, what this country is. When you shred the idea of voting, when you say, it's inconvenient, we'll do it some other time, what you're basically saying is it doesn't really matter. It's all a game. It doesn't really matter. And I think the Trump administration, when I said it was a trial balloon, I think what they were doing is just sort of trying to get us normalized, get us accustomed to this idea.
He's been doing this forever. He talked about postponing that election, or maybe having a third term, but since he was running for office.
That's right. And, his people on Fox News and Breitbart have said, well, he should be given an extra 2 years because we were, held up by the impeachment inquiry and the Russia inquiry. And, you look at this, you're like, where are they coming up with ideas? There's no constitutional rationale for it. There's no historical parallel. There's no reason for it. It's nonsense. It's blather. It's sort of meaningless words, and they throw it out there. It's like spaghetti. They throw it out there. They see what sticks. And every so often an idea sticks. So when I said trial balloon, I suspect they were throwing it out there and just seeing what the reaction would be. Was there going to be outrage? Was there going to be, nobody paying attention? Were people going to say, oh, well, I'll never do this? And so that's why it's so important to show, in actual fact, there will be outrage and there will be people protesting. You cannot do this.
You write in your piece that several Republican-led states are encouraging employers to report employees who say they are too afraid to return to work. Why are they employing this reporting strategy? This is super Nazi Nazi Germany. Report on your neighbors, report. And
Yeah.
what are the repercussions for employees who aren't coming to work out of fear of contracting the disease?
So the argument is that Congress temporarily massively expanded unemployment benefits. So it made it easier to claim unemployment, and then it expanded the amount of unemployment check you get. So there were these $600 a week surpluses added on. And so you have a number of Republicans, Lindsey Graham being the sort of most vocal, who have said, well, this is a sort of moral hazard, that what it's doing is it's creating a disincentive to work. You've got people who are getting unemployment benefits that at least equal the value of their lost wages, in some cases maybe even exceed the value of their lost wages, and they'll never return to work unless you sort of produce a stick as well as a carrot. So the theory behind this is, well, as we reopen the economy, we've got to, in some ways, find a way to push people back into the workforce, because otherwise, we're going to have this, extremely high level of unemployment, and people won't want to go back to work because they feel they can just rely on these payments from the government forever. It's disingenuous because nobody's been talking about making these payments permanent. All you have is an argument within Congress as to how long the temporary payments should go on for. And you have some in Congress saying end them immediately. Lindsey Graham pretty much saying end them immediately. They've done their job. And a lot of people saying, well, it's too soon to end them because there's still a public health crisis. So the strategy in some of the Republican states, in Iowa, I think Nebraska, I believe in Texas and a few others, is that they're giving employers essentially a telephone hotline where they can call in and they could say, here, so-and-so was offered a job, they didn't go back to work, and therefore the government can then proceed to cut their unemployment benefits off. So it's a way of coercing people back into the workforce, even if the pandemic is still raging around them. So, it's a really unpleasant coercive mechanism of using a financial penalty as a way to get people back to work, even in a situation that isn't necessarily safe for them.
This is really something. So do you have a barometer that I'm sorry, I'm going back, but we have a lot of comments coming in here. Do you have a barometer that you use to evaluate when the country has fallen into complete fascism? How close are we? It's not like they're going to change the name. Democracy.
I think,
fascism.
It's the kind of sort of soft slide that it's hard to identify one single moment. Nazi Germany, it was very easy to identify a single moment. There was the election of Hitler, and then there was the enabling legislation that followed shortly afterwards, which personalized his power. And so, you had you basically had.
We're getting there slowly.
Well, the thing is, yes, to a point. And I wrote about this, that when the Senate voted to acquit Trump on the impeachment trial, carte blanche to do anything, because they basically said there's nothing you can do that is so criminal that will get rid of you. So that's, if you're looking for a moment, he unleashed by the Senate vote. He basically at that point realized he could do anything and there was no legislative mechanism to stop him. And he knew by that point the courts, certainly the US Supreme Court, virtually nothing he could do that the Supreme Court would say you've gone too far. Because again, the lower courts would say you can't do this to immigrants, you can't do this to this group, you can't do this to that group. They'd fast track the appeal up to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court by a 5-4 majority would say, well, actually you can ban Muslims, you can shut the border to asylum seekers, you can throw people back across the border in a public health emergency. And so he's been sort of really unleashed by the Senate and by the Supreme Court. But, I still don't think there'll be that literal moment where you can say, all right, before this moment, America was a functioning democracy, and after this moment, it was a fully fascist state.
Right, because we're not functioning right now.
It's been a soft slide for 4 years, and, maybe more than 4 years.
More than that, yeah.
Trump's at least as much a consequence as a cause. He came about because so much of the system was viewed as being broken. But I certainly think you can look at it, when you have armed paramilitary groups in Michigan shutting down state government, to me, that is indicative of a slide towards, some form of fascism, because paramilitarism is a key component of fascism. When you have a complete disregard for basic scientific information and the demonization of public health experts because their information is inconvenient, that's, again, another marker of a slide towards fascism. The treatment of immigrants and other vulnerable groups. Again, any marker of fascism, it involves a systematic use of state power to demonize a vulnerable population. So for the Nazis, it was Jews, or it was the Roma population, or it was gays, or it was the men. And in this country at the moment, it's immigrants.
Mm.
And it doesn't really matter which group. So for a while it was Muslims, or it was Mexicans, or it was Central Americans, and bugbear for the right are Chinese. And so you're almost certainly going to get, exclusion laws for Chinese students, for Chinese businessmen, for Chinese journalists, which sort of resemble the 1885 Chinese Exclusion Act. But it's clearer and clearer that this government only survives through demonizing minority populations. Trump's whole original strategy of getting reelected was boom economy, you've never had it so good, 3% unemployment, stock market at all-time highs, and that's gone out the window. Now he's running for re-election with 1 in 4 American workers unemployed and the worst economic crisis for nearly 100 years. So the only chance he has is, basically a brown shirt strategy. And I think we're going to see this more and more over the coming 6 months.
If you have any questions, if you're watching on Facebook or Twitch, now is the time, because we've kept Sasha way over his the time we asked him to be here with us. So now is the time to put them into the stream chat. We have a lot of comments. Jax Rogue says, I miss the days when they bothered to hide the corruption. At least the Dems have the common decency to hide it. Which I think is funny. The final question I had, if there's no other questions coming in from the chat, how can we get past the fascism fatigue caused by an administration that just is threatening to normalize this erosion of democracy? I think if we had that one breaking point that, instead of the slow slide, maybe there would have been more of an uproar. But we have the slow slide and people are like, yeah, I guess we are fascist now. What do we?
I think that 4 years is an awfully long time to ask people to stay permanently engaged and alert to what's happening. And so things have become normalized over time that, if you had said 4 years ago, this is where we're going to be, we're going to have no due process for immigrants, we're going to lock down the border, all these things that, are now going on. An awful lot of people, even people who had sort of held their nose and voted for Trump, would have said, that's not who we are as a people, we're better than that, we're not going to go down that road. But we've become like the frog that gets put into slowly heated water. We don't realize what's happening until it's too late. And so, there is that fatigue, and there's that difficulty of staying engaged and difficulty of sort of measuring, what's really going on versus, my column's called The Signal Noise. What's the signal? What's the really important stuff versus the noise? What's just the sort of blather that's thrown out into the social media ecosystem? And,
that's why we love it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, but to me, one of the most dispiriting things about the Trump era is the sort of inevitability that things that should never have been normalized would become, and then did become, normalized. Because if you throw it all out there often enough, it's so exhausting that people tune out. And so, one day we'll get past the Trump era, in the same way as one day the Germans got past Nazi Germany, one day the Spanish got past Franco's rule. But, these kind of disruptions last decades. There's, even if Trump's voted out in November, and even if he accepts his loss and leaves power in January, the damage he's done is going to be there. The damage to reputation, to psyche, to, the well-being of the public is going to be there. And I think, shame is a word we should be using here. That, in the same way as after World War II, Germany went through a profound period of shame, we should be feeling shame at what we have allowed to happen in this country. And, whether or not we voted for Trump, we should be feeling shame that our democracy has sunk so low, and that we let gangsters and crooks and grifters take charge of our country.
Well, and we tried not to.
We tried not to, but it happened. And, there is going to be that profound psychological reckoning after the fact, because we're going to be forced to confront what happened. And after all of the noise goes away, and after all of the hyper-partisanship goes away, and after the media calms down, after we stop having, these sort of far-right social media, storms around Trump, after all of that stuff fades into history, we're going to have to grapple with the consequences culturally, politically, morally, that we allowed to happen in the 2016 to 2020 moment. And so I do think that shame is something that, is going to be part of our collective cultural response over the next decade or two?
We're speaking with Sasha Abramsky. I've got a bunch of questions here, but I'm just going to, I think, ask you the one, since I appreciate you being here with us. So you're getting used to.
You can go for two if you want. How about that?
Oh, okay, thank you so much. Okay, so from Miss Vivian Wolf, she says, I spoke with Robert Paxton recently, and he was very reluctant to call Trump fascist because of his libertarian economic views. What is your opinion on this?
I don't think Trump does have libertarian economic views. If you look at Trump's nationalist economic policies, he's extremely coercive. He's willing to use tariffs any and every way to bludgeon both overseas countries, but also domestic companies. He's extremely willing to punish political opponents economically. And that's not libertarian. That's not sort of Adam Smith economics. And in some ways, when you look at Trump's sort of economic nationalism and the economic nationalism of his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, autarkic. It's this idea that you can create an entirely self-sufficient country that can shun or shut off the rest of the world, or use the rest of the world only for extractive purposes. But the idea of mutual benefit, the idea of give and take in international relations, both political and economic, isn't there. It's all about America first. And of course, it's not really about America first, because that rhetoric, what it really is about is Trumpism first. It's about benefit to the cronies around Trump. So it's a very corrupt economics. It's full of conflicts of interest. It's full of cronyism. It's anything but libertarian. So, you know, when you look at any fascist experiment, when you look at Pinochet in Chile, for example, you know, there was an element of economic deregulation. He privatized the pension system, for example. But there was also an element of extreme economic coercion. Anti-union coercion being a case in point, anti-worker coercion. So, you know, Trump's Labor Department is hostile both to trade unions and to the minimum wage. They've basically dismantled the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. They've deregulated environmental protections that benefit poor communities in particular. There's nothing libertarian about this. This is about sort of, in a sense, private capital on steroids, backed up by a strong, muscular, and corrupt state apparatus.
Oh, and the final question we have, which might be more fun to answer, is, will we ever get out of this, from Dr. Win-Win, will we ever get out of this malicious leadership vortex? And if so, how do you see that happening?
Well, I think we will get out of it. It's a matter of whether we do in 2020 or whether we do in 2024, or at some point we get beyond this.
At some point, climate change is going to kill us all. So
yeah,
we can't last forever.
We may get beyond it in twin spiral, you know, in spiraling catastrophes, military catastrophes, economic catastrophes, public health catastrophes, climate catastrophes, you know, but at some point Trumpism will be so clearly a failed that it will disappear into the history books. It's never had majority support. Not a single day in Trump's presidency has he had majority support. His signature policy, environment, on immigration, have never enjoyed majority support. This is, you know, rampant minoritarian government in which Trump only views his base as the real, and everybody else, everything else is expendable. The question is, you know, how do we get beyond it? Not whether we'll get beyond it. And I think we get beyond it by staying engaged and staying alert and refusing to be inured to all the things that we've been talking about in this past hour. We get beyond it by recognizing that however scary the pandemic is, there are other things also to consider. That, you know, in the middle of a public health emergency, we still have to care about the environment. We still have to care about immigration. We still have to care about, you know, worker protections. We get beyond it by, you know, throwing as much weight as we can into progressive movements at the city, the county, and the state level, because there's more room for creative, progressive politics there.
And we do see that happening. I've had some nice progressive local candidates come on the program here, so that is nice to see that.
That's the weird thing, that, you know, the federal government has maybe never in American history been so reactionary and so corrupt, but at a state level and at a city level, you're kinds of interesting stuff going on. And in some ways, the pandemic is catalyzing that, because it's forcing state governments to rely more on regional compacts, because they know the federal government isn't there. Federal government's just not doing what it's supposed to be doing regarding testing, regarding getting up tracking mechanisms and tracing mechanisms. It's just not there. So you're seeing these really interesting progressive regional compacts emerging. And that, I think, ultimately will be how we get beyond it, that you'll see more and more and more regions essentially just saying to Trump, go your own way, we don't want to follow you. And Trump will eventually be the president of, a country in name only, but you'll have regional groups and all these regional alliances trying to work out more rational forward paths.
We're speaking with Sasha Abramsky of The Nation. Thank you so much for being with us. The column is called Signal Noise. Don't miss it. It's one of my favorite places to go because there's so much noise right now that it's really difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff. And I'm glad that you're doing it for us. So thanks for being on the program with us.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and looking forward to it next time. Thanks again.
I swear to God, 2 weeks goes by in a flash. I'm always thrilled when I see that it's Sasha Abramsky week on the program. So thanks again. Be well until our next conversation.
All right. Take care.